I don't let black waitresses serve my table." The sentence landed harder than the crystal water glass that had just been placed on the linen-covered table. Every conversation inside Bellamy House, one of Charlotte's most prestigious downtown restaurants, dissolved into an uneasy silence. Forks paused halfway to polish porcelain plates. A pianist in the corner missed a note. Even the soft hum of expensive conversations seemed to disappear beneath the weight of those 11 words. Naomi Brooks stood perfectly still beside the table, her serving tray balanced effortlessly against one palm. Her dark brown eyes remained calm, though 1,000 emotions flickered behind them. She had heard comments before. Some whispered, some disguised as jokes, some spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear. Yet something about the certainty in this man's voice carried a different kind of chill, the kind that came from someone who believed his position placed him beyond ordinary decency. Richard Hawthorne slowly folded the menu and placed it on the table as if he had all the time in the world. His charcoal-tailored suit fit with flawless precision. His silver cufflinks caught the warm glow of the chandelier above, and the expensive watch around his wrist reflected the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to making million-dollar decisions before breakfast. Around Charlotte, people recognized him immediately. CEO of Hawthorne Dynamics, featured on magazine covers, speaker at leadership conferences, a businessman whose opinion could move stock prices before lunchtime. Richard looked directly at Naomi without raising his voice. "Find someone else." His expression remained perfectly composed. "I said I don't let black waitresses serve my table." A woman seated 2 tables away lowered her eyes toward her coffee cup. An elderly couple exchanged an uncomfortable glance. One young server near the kitchen entrance instinctively took a small step forward before freezing again, unsure whether to intervene or pretend nothing had happened. Bellamy House had built its reputation on elegance, impeccable service, and quiet dignity. Tonight, dignity seemed to have slipped quietly out the revolving front door. Naomi felt dozens of eyes settle on her uniform. The neatly pressed white shirt, the black apron tied carefully around her waist, the polished name tag that simply read Naomi. She drew one slow breath, steady and measured, refusing to let embarrassment dictate the rhythm of her heartbeat. Her grandmother used to tell her that the loudest storms rarely lasted forever, but the way people carried themselves during those storms stayed with witnesses for a lifetime. She gently adjusted the folded napkin resting over her forearm before speaking, her voice calm enough to soften the tension without surrendering her self-respect. "Good evening, sir. My name is Naomi Brooks. I'll make sure you receive excellent service while you're here." Richard's lips curled into the faintest smile, though there was no warmth behind it. "That's exactly what I asked you not to do." Somewhere behind Naomi, a wine glass softly touched the marble countertop. In the open kitchen, chefs slowed their movements almost instinctively, sensing that something far more important than dinner had just begun. Outside, the last golden light of the North Carolina sunset spilled through the towering windows, stretching long reflections across the polished hardwood floor until it reached Naomi's shoes. She didn't step back. She didn't argue. She simply met Richard Hawthorne's eyes with quiet composure, unaware that before this evening was over, the lesson neither of them expected would begin with respect, not revenge. Naomi Brooks had learned long before that dignity was rarely handed to anyone. It was something a person carried quietly, especially on the days when the world tried to take it away. Every weekday began at 5:30 in the morning inside a modest brick duplex on the east side of Charlotte, where the aroma of fresh coffee blended with the scent of lavender from the small garden her late grandmother had planted years earlier. Before leaving for work, Naomi always checked on her mother, Evelyn, whose heart condition had forced her into early retirement after 3 decades as an elementary school librarian. The medical bills were stacked neatly inside a blue folder on the kitchen counter, never discussed during breakfast, yet never forgotten. Naomi simply smiled every morning, kissed her mother on the forehead, and promised that everything would work out somehow. She believed those words because someone in the family had to. By 7 o'clock, she attended classes at the Charlotte School of Law, sitting near the front of every lecture hall with handwritten notes organized in color-coded folders. Her professors knew her as the student who asked thoughtful questions without ever trying to impress anyone. Most of her classmates never realized that the young woman discussing constitutional law each morning would spend her evenings carrying serving trays through one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Naomi never hid it, but she never advertised it either. Work was work, and honest work deserved no apology. She often remembered something her grandmother used to repeat while polishing old family photographs. Character is what you keep after pride leaves the room. Those words had become her compass. Every shift at Bellamy House offered a different lesson about people. Some customers noticed only the silverware. Others noticed the person placing it on the table. Naomi greeted every guest with the same steady smile because she refused to let another person's assumptions determine the quality of her own kindness. The younger servers admired her patience. New employees quietly copied the way she remembered birthdays, favorite desserts, and children's names after only one visit. Even the restaurant manager, Michael Carter, relied on her whenever difficult guests filled the reservation list. If Naomi cannot calm the room, he often joked to the staff, nobody can. Yet tonight felt different from the moment Richard Hawthorne walked through the front entrance. There had been something unusually cold in the way conversations shifted around him, as though success had become a shield separating him from ordinary human connection. Naomi had noticed it before he ever spoke a single word to her. She had also noticed the laptop resting beside his untouched menu, its screen still glowing with what appeared to be financial reports and dozens of unread messages arriving one after another. She deliberately looked away. Privacy mattered. Respect mattered. Everything her mother and grandmother had taught her pointed toward treating people with the dignity she hoped to receive herself. Across the dining room, candles flickered gently against polished glass, reflecting soft circles of light across the marble floor while outside the last traces of sunset faded behind Charlotte's skyline. Guests slowly resumed their conversations, but their voices carried an unmistakable hesitation, as if everyone sensed that the evening had only reached its opening chapter, and that the quiet woman standing beside table 12 possessed a strength no expensive suit could ever purchase. Richard Hawthorne did not believe respect was something every person automatically deserved. In his world, respect was earned through titles, quarterly reports, acquisitions, and numbers displayed on towering office screens overlooking the Charlotte skyline. At 48 years old, he had transformed Hawthorne Dynamics from a regional manufacturing company into one of the fastest-growing technology firms in the Southeast. Business magazines praised his relentless discipline. Financial news channels called him fearless. Investors admired the certainty in every decision he made. Employees, however, often described something different after the conference room doors closed. They spoke of impossible standards, meetings where silence carried more weight than conversation, and a leader whose approval felt almost impossible to reach. Richard never considered himself cruel. He preferred another word: efficient. Feelings complicated negotiations. Compassion slowed decisions. Personal stories distracted from measurable results. Those beliefs had become the foundation of his success, reinforced year after year by awards displayed across the walnut shelves of his corner office. Somewhere along the way, achievement had quietly convinced him that position reflected personal worth. Without realizing it, he had begun measuring people by the uniforms they wore instead of the character they carried. Earlier that afternoon, his executive assistant had gently suggested postponing dinner after a difficult board meeting stretched nearly 6 exhausting hours. Richard refused. Tomorrow morning, Hawthorne Dynamics would present a proposal to the Sterling Community Investment Foundation, a partnership valued at nearly $100 million over the next decade. Every detail mattered. Every minute mattered. His laptop remained open because revised financial projections continued arriving from analysts scattered across 3 different time zones. He barely noticed the stream of notifications flashing across the screen as new messages appeared every few minutes. His attention remained fixed on strategy, projections, and outcomes. Bellamy House had become his preferred meeting place precisely because the staff rarely interrupted him. Meals arrived on time. Conversations stayed quiet. Business continued uninterrupted. Control, after all, had always been Richard's greatest comfort. As he sat beneath the warm chandelier light, he unconsciously tapped one finger against the polished oak table, a habit that emerged whenever deadlines approached. Across the dining room, several guests recognized him, and whispered respectfully before returning to their own conversations. Richard accepted that attention as naturally as breathing. He had grown accustomed to entering rooms where people stood a little straighter, smiled a little wider, and hurried a little faster. He no longer questioned whether those reactions reflected admiration or obligation. They simply happened. That certainty made Naomi's calm composure feel strangely unfamiliar. Most people either challenged him with visible frustration or retreated into nervous silence. She had done neither. Instead, she answered with steady professionalism, neither apologizing for who she was nor allowing his words to disturb the quiet confidence in her voice. It unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. He looked toward the softly glowing skyline beyond the restaurant windows before returning his attention to another incoming email that appeared briefly across the corner of his laptop screen. Without reading it carefully, he dismissed the notification and reached for his untouched glass of sparkling water. Somewhere deep beneath years of carefully built certainty, an invisible crack had formed, though Richard Hawthorne remained completely unaware that before the night ended, the greatest challenge to his leadership would not come from a competitor, a shareholder, or a board member. It would come from the one person in the room he had decided was beneath his notice. Naomi reached for the glass pitcher of sparkling water just as a sudden commotion rippled through the dining room. A distinguished elderly gentleman seated near the center window slowly lowered his fork before bringing one trembling hand to his chest. At first, only his wife noticed. She leaned toward him with quiet concern, whispering his name. Within seconds, the concern in her eyes became unmistakable alarm. The silverware slipped gently onto the white tablecloth. A chair scraped across the hardwood floor. Conversation stopped once again, replaced by uncertain glances as diners struggled to understand what was unfolding. The restaurant manager immediately called emergency services, while several guests instinctively stood without knowing how to help. Richard Hawthorne turned toward the disturbance, his expression shifting from irritation to detached curiosity. He remained seated, watching the growing circle of anxious faces surround the elderly man. Naomi did not hesitate. She carefully placed her serving tray on a nearby service station and walked quickly, but calmly, across the dining room. Every movement reflected purpose rather than panic. Kneeling beside the gentleman, she spoke in a steady voice that somehow seemed to quiet everyone else. "Sir, can you hear me? Stay with me. Help is on the way." The gentleman nodded faintly, struggling to answer. Naomi looked toward his wife. Has he ever experienced anything like this before? Through frightened breaths, the woman explained that her husband had a heart condition and had become dizzy several times over the past year. Naomi listened carefully, encouraging the gentleman to remain seated and comfortable while asking another server to bring a folded jacket to support his back. She instructed someone near the entrance to guide the paramedics directly inside as soon as they arrived. Her calm voice spread through the room like gentle light, replacing darkness. Guests who had frozen moments earlier suddenly found simple ways to help because someone had quietly given them direction. Richard watched every second unfold from his table. There was no dramatic display, no desperate shouting, only composed leadership from the very woman he had dismissed minutes earlier. Even the frightened wife seemed to breathe a little easier as Naomi remained beside them, offering reassuring words instead of empty promises. Less than 5 minutes later, the distant sound of sirens faded into the parking lot outside Bellamy House. Paramedics entered carrying medical equipment and immediately praised the organized space waiting for them. One of them glanced briefly toward Naomi before saying, "Thank you. This made our job much easier." Together, they carefully assisted the gentleman onto a stretcher while his wife reached for Naomi's hand with trembling fingers. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you for staying with him." Naomi simply smiled and squeezed her hand gently. "I hope he feels better very soon." The dining room slowly returned to life as the ambulance departed, leaving behind an unusual stillness. Candlelight flickered across untouched dinner plates, and the pianist quietly resumed playing a slow melody that drifted through the room like a deep breath after a storm. Naomi stood, straightened her apron, and returned to her duties without expecting recognition. As she passed table 12 once more, Richard looked up from his laptop. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was uncertainty in his expression now, but pride spoke before gratitude could. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket and said in an even voice, "You were only doing your job." Naomi paused beside the table for a single heartbeat before answering with the same quiet composure she had carried all evening. "Sometimes the smallest part of our job is serving a meal, sir." Richard said nothing. Somewhere deep inside him, a certainty he had trusted for years shifted almost imperceptibly, though. Neither of them yet realized that the evening's greatest revelation had only begun. Richard lifted his glass without responding. Naomi inclined her head politely and stepped away to continue serving the surrounding tables, treating every guest with the same quiet professionalism she had shown since the beginning of her shift. Around the dining room, conversations slowly returned, but they carried a different tone now. Several customers had witnessed exactly what had happened. A few smiled warmly at Naomi as she refilled coffee cups. Others quietly thanked her for helping the elderly gentleman. She acknowledged every kind word with the same humble smile before moving on to the next table. She neither sought attention nor avoided it. Her focus remained on the people she had come to serve. Richard, however, found it increasingly difficult to return his attention to the financial reports glowing across his laptop screen. Numbers that normally demanded his complete concentration now blurred together as fragments of the evening replayed in his mind. Naomi's calm voice, the frightened wife reaching for her hand, the paramedic thanking her. Most unsettling of all was the absence of resentment in her eyes after everything he had said. He had expected anger. He had expected humiliation. Instead, he had encountered composure. That unfamiliar response lingered with him far longer than he wanted to admit. Another email notification quietly appeared in the corner of his screen before disappearing again as he dismissed it without reading. His assistant had marked several messages urgent throughout the evening, but Richard assumed they could wait until he returned to the office. Deadlines had always bowed to his schedule, not the other way around. Across the restaurant, Michael Carter approached Naomi while helping another server organize a fresh tray of desserts. He lowered his voice just enough to avoid drawing attention. "Are you all right?" he asked. Naomi gave a reassuring nod. "I am fine." Michael hesitated before speaking again. "You handled tonight better than most people could have." Naomi gently folded a clean linen napkin before answering. "People reveal themselves. When life becomes uncomfortable, I cannot control what someone else chooses to reveal. I can only choose what I reveal about myself." Michael smiled quietly. It was exactly the answer he had expected from her. Moments later, he returned to the front entrance to welcome a new wave of dinner guests while Naomi carried a tray of freshly prepared entrees toward another section of the dining room. The warm aroma of rosemary, grilled salmon, and freshly baked sourdough drifted through the softly lit space. Crystal glasses reflected tiny circles of golden light across the polished tables. Outside, the city skyline shimmered beneath the deep blue evening sky, and the restaurant gradually settled back into its familiar rhythm. Richard closed his laptop for the first time since arriving. His appetite had quietly disappeared. Instead of satisfaction, he felt an unfamiliar restlessness that no successful negotiation had ever produced. As he reached for his jacket, one of the younger servers accidentally brushed against his chair while delivering bread to a neighboring table. "I am so sorry, sir," the young man said immediately. Richard looked up, prepared to respond sharply, but before any words left his mouth, he noticed Naomi several feet away helping an elderly couple laugh over a shared dessert. Her kindness appeared effortless, untouched by the disrespect she had endured only minutes earlier. He looked back at the nervous young server standing beside him and simply replied, "It is all right." The words surprised even him. The server smiled with visible relief before walking away. Richard remained seated for another long moment, staring through the restaurant windows at the reflections dancing across the glass. For the first time in years, success felt strangely incomplete, as though something far more valuable than profit had quietly entered the room while he had been too distracted to notice. Richard finally left Bellamy House nearly an hour later, but the quiet confidence he usually carried out into the night had been replaced by an unfamiliar silence. The revolving glass door closed softly behind him as a cool Carolina breeze swept across the sidewalk, carrying the scent of fresh rain from somewhere beyond the glowing skyline. His driver stepped forward to open the rear door of the black sedan, Yet Richard remained standing for a moment, looking back through the restaurant windows. Inside, the dinner rush continued as though the evening had never paused. Naomi moved gracefully from table to table beneath the warm chandelier light, offering the same gentle smile to every guest without favor, without resentment, without hesitation. From the sidewalk, she appeared almost ordinary, another hard-working waitress finishing another demanding shift. Yet Richard found himself unable to explain why she seemed to occupy the room with a presence far greater than anyone wearing an expensive suit. He quietly entered the car, loosened his tie, and rested his laptop beside him as the sedan pulled away from the curb. Charlotte's skyscrapers reflected across the windows while streams of headlights painted ribbons of white and red beneath the night sky. Normally, he spent every ride reviewing reports or preparing for the next day's meetings. Tonight, he simply watched the city drift past in silence. Every traffic light seemed longer than usual. Every reflection reminded him of the steady way Naomi had answered him without anger. He replayed her final words again. "Sometimes the smallest part of our job is serving a meal, sir." The sentence lingered in the stillness like a melody refusing to fade. Back inside Bellamy House, the final guests gradually settled their checks while soft piano music floated gently across the nearly empty dining room. Naomi folded fresh napkins beside the service station before wiping down a polished wooden table overlooking the street. Michael Carter approached carrying 2 warm mugs of herbal tea. Without saying a word, he placed one beside her. Naomi smiled appreciatively. They stood together for a quiet moment watching the reflections of passing cars shimmer across the restaurant windows. Finally, Michael spoke. "You know, most people would have walked away tonight." Naomi wrapped both hands around the warm mug, feeling the gentle heat spread through her fingers. "Walking away is easy," she answered softly. "Keeping your peace is harder." Michael nodded thoughtfully. Neither of them mentioned Richard again. There seemed little reason to. Naomi believed kindness should never depend upon another person's response. Whether it was appreciated or ignored, it remained the right choice. Outside, a light rain finally began to fall, tiny droplets tracing gentle paths down the tall windows until the lights of downtown Charlotte blurred into soft ribbons of gold. Naomi watched the rain for a long moment before gathering her books from the employee locker. At the very top rested tomorrow's constitutional law assignment, its pages marked with careful handwritten notes in blue ink. She smiled quietly. There was still studying to finish before sunrise, another early class, another shift, another ordinary day waiting ahead. She slipped the notebook carefully into her backpack and turned off the small locker light. Across the city, Richard unlocked the door to his penthouse apartment overlooking the skyline. The spacious rooms felt unusually empty despite every luxury surrounding him. He placed his laptop on the dining table, intending to prepare for the morning presentation, but instead found himself standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows, listening to the rain tap gently against the glass. For the first time in many years, the silence did not feel peaceful. It felt like a question, one he could not yet answer. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale sunlight and lingering rain clouds drifting above Charlotte's skyline. Richard Hawthorne stepped into the executive conference room on the 32nd floor of Hawthorne Dynamics, carrying the same leather portfolio he had carried into hundreds of successful meetings before. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the room with cool morning light, reflecting across the polished walnut conference table where board members and representatives from the Sterling Community Investment Foundation were already taking their seats. Fresh coffee filled the air, blending with the faint scent of polished wood and expensive leather. Richard welcomed the guests with his usual confidence, believing the morning would unfold exactly as planned. The presentation began smoothly. Revenue projections appeared across the large display screen. Market forecasts drew approving nods from several directors. Everything seemed perfectly under control until the chairman of the Sterling Foundation quietly entered the room nearly 15 minutes late. Richard immediately recognized the distinguished elderly gentleman from the restaurant the previous evening. The same gentleman Naomi had comforted while everyone else stood frozen. Richard paused for only a fraction of a second before extending his hand. The chairman smiled politely and accepted the greeting, though his expression remained thoughtful. Once everyone was seated again, the chairman looked around the room before speaking in a calm, measured voice. Before we discuss investments, I would like to thank someone who is not here today. The room fell silent. Richard frowned slightly, unsure where the conversation was heading. The chairman continued. Last night, I experienced a medical emergency while having dinner with my wife. One remarkable young woman remained calm, organized the people around her, reassured my family, and made certain help reached me without unnecessary confusion. Her kindness reminded me that leadership is revealed long before anyone receives a title. Several board members exchanged curious glances. Richard felt an uncomfortable weight settle across his shoulders. The chairman slowly turned toward him. Mr. Hawthorne, I understand you were there. Richard nodded carefully. Yes, I was. The chairman smiled gently, though there was unmistakable disappointment behind his eyes. Then you also witnessed something even more valuable than professional service. Richard remained silent. The chairman folded his hands together. My wife told me that after saving my evening, that young woman was treated with very little respect. No one around the table moved. The quiet hum of the building's ventilation system suddenly seemed unusually loud. Richard lowered his eyes for the first time since the meeting had begun. Images from Bellamy House returned with perfect clarity. Naomi standing beside his table. Naomi reassuring frightened strangers. Naomi answering every insult with dignity instead of resentment. The chairman spoke once more, his voice gentle rather than accusing. Businesses do not succeed because of intelligence alone. They succeed because people trust the character of those leading them. Richard slowly looked up, but he found no anger in the chairman's face, only sincere disappointment. Somehow that was far more difficult to bear. The chairman reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed a neatly folded restaurant receipt. My wife asked me to keep this, he said quietly. On the back, that young waitress wrote a simple reminder while we waited for the ambulance. He unfolded the paper and read aloud. Respect costs nothing, but it can change everything. No one spoke after that. Sunlight streamed quietly across the conference table, illuminating the receipt resting in the chairman's hands. Richard stared at those handwritten words, realizing that the greatest lesson of his career had not come from a celebrated executive, a prestigious university, or a multi-million-dollar negotiation. It had come from the woman he had chosen not to see. Richard left the conference room carrying neither triumph nor frustration, only a quiet humility that felt unfamiliar after decades of believing success alone defined a person's worth. The chairman's words continued echoing through his mind as he rode the elevator down from the 32nd floor. Respect costs nothing, but it can change everything. The polished steel walls reflected a man who suddenly looked older than he had the day before. Not because of the passing years, but because he had finally seen a flaw that no financial statement had ever revealed. Without returning to his office, Richard instructed his driver to take him directly to Bellamy House. The afternoon sun broke through the lingering clouds, washing the streets of Charlotte in warm golden light that shimmered across rain-soaked sidewalks. When he stepped through the restaurant doors, the familiar sound of quiet conversations and gently clinking glasses greeted him once again. Several employees recognized him immediately, but there was no excitement this time, only curiosity. Michael Carter approached with his usual professional smile. Good afternoon, Mr. Hawthorne. How may we help you today? Richard hesitated before answering. I am here to speak with Naomi Brooks, if she is available. Michael studied his expression for a brief moment, sensing something had changed. He nodded and quietly disappeared toward the dining room. A few moments later, Naomi emerged wearing the same neatly pressed uniform she had worn the previous evening. She carried a small order pad in one hand and greeted Richard with the same calm professionalism she offered every guest. Good afternoon, sir. Welcome back. There was no bitterness in her voice, no satisfaction, no trace of revenge. That simple kindness made Richard lower his eyes for a moment before speaking. I owe you an apology. The nearby conversations gradually softened as a few guests sensed the importance of the moment unfolding only a few feet away. Richard stood with both hands resting quietly at his sides. Yesterday, I judged you before I knew anything about you. I spoke to you without respect. I was wrong. Naomi listened without interrupting. Richard continued, his voice steadier now. The chairman of the Sterling Foundation reminded me this morning that leadership begins with character. You reminded me of that before he ever did. I simply refused to see it. Silence settled gently between them. Sunlight poured through the tall front windows, casting warm reflections across the polished floor where dozens of footsteps had passed unnoticed throughout the years. Naomi finally smiled, not because she had won, but because someone had chosen growth instead of pride. "Thank you for saying that," she answered softly. "Apologies matter because they allow people to move forward." Richard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a business card. "I would like to offer you any opportunity my company can provide. Tuition assistance, an internship, anything that helps you achieve your dream." Naomi glanced briefly at the card before folding Richard's fingers back around it with quiet gentleness. "I appreciate your generosity," she said, "but I do not need a reward for treating people with kindness." Richard looked at her in surprise. Naomi continued with the same peaceful confidence that had carried her through every difficult moment. "If you truly wish to honor yesterday, then remember this feeling the next time you meet someone whose uniform, job title, or appearance is different from yours. Character is revealed by how we treat people who cannot offer us anything in return." Richard slowly nodded. He slipped the untouched business card back into his pocket, understanding that the greatest gift Naomi had given him could never fit inside an envelope or a contract. It was the chance to become a better man, and for the first time in many years, that opportunity felt far more valuable than any business deal he had ever signed. Autumn slowly gave way to winter, and life continued with the quiet rhythm that neither applause nor headlines could ever imitate. Bellamy House remained as elegant as ever, its crystal chandeliers casting warm reflections across polished tables each evening while soft piano melodies drifted through the dining room. Naomi Brooks still arrived early for every shift, greeting each guest with the same steady kindness that had always defined her. Nothing about her uniform had changed. The neatly pressed white shirt, the black apron, the polished name tag bearing only her first name remained exactly the same. Yet something invisible had changed forever. People noticed her differently now, not because they knew her story, but because genuine character has a quiet way of revealing itself long before anyone speaks about it. A few months later, Naomi completed another successful semester at the Charlotte School of Law. One afternoon, as she walked across campus carrying a backpack filled with heavy textbooks, she received a handwritten letter rather than another electronic notification. Inside was a scholarship from the Sterling Community Investment Foundation, awarded to students whose compassion reflected exceptional leadership. There was no publicity campaign attached to it, no television cameras waiting outside, no ceremony designed to attract attention. At the bottom of the letter, beneath the chairman's signature, appeared one handwritten sentence: "Never underestimate the influence of quiet courage." Naomi folded the letter carefully and smiled before placing it between the pages of her constitutional law textbook, knowing her grandmother would have treasured those words. Across the city, change unfolded in quieter ways inside Hawthorne Dynamics. Employees gradually noticed that meetings had become different. Richard Hawthorne no longer hurried past reception without making eye contact. He learned the names of custodians, security officers, assistants, and cafeteria workers who had spent years helping his company succeed without ever expecting recognition. During one executive meeting, when a junior administrative assistant hesitated to share an idea, Richard gently encouraged her to continue. Her suggestion eventually saved the company thousands of dollars on an upcoming project. Several executives exchanged surprised glances, remembering a time when such voices would never have been invited into the conversation. The culture of the company began changing one respectful interaction at a time. No announcement declared it. No slogan decorated the walls. People simply noticed that leadership had become more human. One quiet Friday evening, months after their first encounter, Richard returned once again to Bellamy House. This time, when Naomi approached his table, he stood before she could say a word. He smiled warmly and extended his hand with genuine respect. "Good evening, Naomi. It is nice to see you again." She shook his hand with the same calm smile she had always carried. "Welcome back, Mr. Hawthorne." Nothing more needed to be said. Sometimes the strongest apologies continue long after the words themselves have been spoken. As Richard took his seat, he noticed a young family entering the restaurant. Their little daughter smiled shyly at one of the servers carrying menus. Richard smiled back before quietly holding the door open for them. It was such a small gesture that almost no one noticed, yet Naomi did. She looked toward the front entrance for only a brief moment before returning to her work, her expression peaceful beneath the warm glow of the chandelier. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently through the evening air, settling softly upon the sidewalks of Charlotte, while the restaurant windows reflected golden light into the quiet street. Inside, silverware clinked gently against porcelain. Conversations blended into a comforting murmur, and two people who had once stood on opposite sides of prejudice now shared the same understanding without another speech. Respect had not changed the world overnight. It had simply changed one heart, and sometimes that is exactly where lasting justice begins.